Bonjour, Kinamagi and Nene Ireland Dishnikas with today's social studies lesson. Today's topic, Social Studies Chapter 2, Section 3, the Eastern Woodlands. Just as a reminder, we are looking at this section of Turtle Island, or North America, just pointing out some important landmarks. You can see over here the Mississippi River Valley. You can see the Appalachian Mountains, the Great Lakes, including Michigan. We're right around here. You see the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico. Up here, a little further, Hudson Bay. The Eastern Woodlands don't mysteriously stop at the Canadian border. Remember, national borders, as far as in between different indigenous nations, do not necessarily follow anything resembling the current political borders. Here's Hudson Bay up here. We have a lot of different land forms here. We have coastal plains, we have interior plains, and it is rather hilly / mountainous through this region. If you've ever driven towards Washington, D.C. or the East Coast, you've seen some, what seems to us to be tall mountains, even though people in the Rockies might disagree with us. The purpose of today's lesson is to look at the different lifestyles, and we're going to be looking at two different Eastern Woodlands group. These are from links attached to our social studies reading from the Michigan Open Book Project. First one will be the Creek Nation, and that's an English term for them, and that's going to be down in this region here. Then we'll be looking at the Iroquois, which will be in this region, just to give you kind of that, and we're over here. The Ojibwe. I'm not going to read this entire thing to you. This is linked within the Google Classroom for you to read. And there's a lot of little question and answers here. You can look back at fuller pages. But looking at the creek, you can see they're split up into different bands, just like we are. Each village was led by a chief who was selected by a tribal council. That's very similar to what we do now. And now they're elected and can be either gender. Talk about languages. What were men's and women's roles? Creek men were hunters and sometimes went to war to protect families. Creek women were farmers and also did most of the child care and cooking. Both took part in storytelling, artwork, and music, and traditional medicine. You see in the past, the chief was always a man. They lived in single-family houses arranged around a village square. Creek houses were made of plaster and river cane walls with thatched roofs. They also built larger circular buildings for ceremonial purposes, and most towns had a ball field with benches for spectators. Some Creek villages had palisades, reinforced walls around them to guard against attack. They wore breechcloths and leather leggings, taking advantage of what's in the environment around them. Women wore wraparound skirts and mantles made of deer skin or woven fiber, which tells us that quite likely, if you're going to be traditional clothing, there was probably wawaskish in those woods or deer. Talks about they did not wear war bonnets. As we know that in popular culture, we tended to draw everything with war bonnets, with all of these feathers, and that's not true in many of our different Native nations, although in some regions, those were a thing. They made long dugout canoes from cypress logs, which tells us that cypress was probably a common type of tree in that area. They were farming people, corn, beans, squash, deer, wild turkeys, small game. You see some of the different tribes they lived and interacted with. And now let's look at the Iroquois, which we know is in the New York, but it did spread out and they did have influence even into the throughout the Eastern Great Lakes. See the listing of tribes. You can see the mention of the Huron. They were distant relatives of the Iroquois Confederacy tribes and speak related languages, but they were never part of the Confederacy. And historically, the Huron is attributed to having lived in southeast Michigan. The Confederacy, also known as the League, Iroquois League, was governed by the council. Each nation sent between 8 and 14 leaders to the Great Council. They agreed on political decisions through discussion and voting. That sounds very similar to what's done in the United States today, where each entity, in our case states, send representatives to Congress. So maybe you start to see where maybe we start borrowing ideas. Although these politicians were called chiefs, they were actually elected officials chosen by clan mothers of each tribe. Each nation also had its own tribal council to make local decisions. This is similar to how American states each have their own government. And so you can start seeing there's some similarities in government between the Iroquois and us here in Michigan, but also the Iroquois and the system that was eventually adapted and adopted by the United States. There were 6 different languages, but they're related to each other. Kind of like you would find that we can understand what the Odawa or Potawatomi are saying in many cases, and they can understand us even though it's a distinct language. Looking at here, men were in charge of hunting, trading, and war. Women in charge of farming, property, and family. So you can see a similarity between the north and south parts of the eastern woodlands, at least amongst these 2 tribes. And remember when we were talking about these things, that just because these 2 tribes and groups of tribes do this, doesn't mean that all different nations did it this way, because of the fact that each nation has its own unique culture and history. Not everything is going to be the same throughout the eastern woodlands, just like not every national government in North America is the same. Chiefs made military decisions and trade agreements. Only men represented the Confederacy at the council, but only women voted to determine who the representatives of each tribe would be. Both took part in storytelling, artwork, and music and medicine. They lived in the longhouses, as you can see a picture sketch right here. So they were very long structures covered with sheets of elm bark. So you could assume that elm was probably a common tree in that region. It could be up to 100 feet long, which is about 33 yards. And each one housed an entire clan, as many as 60 people. They wore breechcloths with long leggings. Women wore wraparound skirts with shorter leggings. Men did not originally wear shirts in Iroquois culture, but women often wore a tunic called an overdress. Iroquois people also wear moccasins on their feet and heavy robes in winter, as we know that it is much colder in northern New York compared to Alabama and Georgia, where the Creek were. Transportation, they used an elm bark or dugout canoe. Fishing trips, but preferred to travel by land. They did corns, bean, and squash. That seems a little familiar and will be familiar to this region as well. Hunted with bows and arrows, makes sense. Pretty common tool here. You see that we did interact amongst the Ojibwe with the Iroquois historically. Lacrosse is the national game of the Iroquois. In fact, the Iroquois puts up a national team that competes internationally. It is actually very highly ranked, better than most countries on the planet. You can see and read about them in the news, and occasionally you'll actually see them competing on television as well. This concludes this brief overview of these two documents. Please return to the Google Classroom and answer the questions, and that'll be all for today's lesson. Mama P.